The sun was already setting when he stepped off the bus, his old suitcase heavy in his hand. The Wellington Conservatory of Music stood before him like a castle from another time, all stone and tall windows that caught the last golden light of day. For a boy who had grown up in a house where the roof sometimes leaked when it rained hard, this place looked like it belonged in a dream. Lee had practiced for this moment since he was 6 years old, first on a keyboard his mother had found at a yard sale, then on the church piano whenever the building was empty. Now, at 18, he stood before the most famous music school in the country, a scholarship paper folded carefully in his pocket, and his hands trembling slightly with a mix of excitement and fear. "You must be one of the new students here," said a voice behind him. Lee turned to see an older gentleman in a neat uniform. "The dormitory is that way," the man pointed. "Registration ends in 30 minutes. Lee thanked him and hurried along the stone path. Around him, other young people moved with purpose, many carrying instrument cases, all looking like they belonged here far more than he did. He heard fragments of conversations as he passed, someone talking about their summer tour with a youth orchestra in Europe, another mentioning their father who played first violin with the National Symphony. The dormitory was a 5-story building with ivy climbing its walls. Inside, a woman with glasses and a tight bun handed him a key after checking his name off a list. "5th floor, room 512, she said without smiling. "Your roommate has already arrived." The room was small but neat, with 2 narrow beds, 2 desks, and a window overlooking the courtyard. On one bed sat a boy about Lee's age arranging expensive-looking clothes in a drawer. "Hello," Lee said, setting down his suitcase. "I'm Lee." The boy looked up, his eyes moving quickly from Lee's face to his worn suitcase and back again. "Thomas," he replied shortly. "I've taken the bed by the window. Hope that's not a problem." "No problem," Lee said, though the bed by the window would have been nice. "Which desk should I use?" "I've set up on the right one already," Thomas said, turning back to his unpacking. "First day classes are tomorrow. Don't set an alarm, I have one on my phone." The next morning, Lee woke early despite Thomas's instructions. Old habits died hard. Back home, he had always risen before the sun to practice before school. When the house was quiet and no one would complain about the noise, the main building of the conservatory was even more impressive in full daylight. Marble floors echoed with footsteps as students hurried to their first classes. Lee found himself in a large classroom where a professor with wild, gray hair was explaining the year's music theory curriculum. You'll be expected to understand not just the notes on the page but the mathematics behind them, the professor said, pacing before a blackboard covered in musical notations. "Music is as much science as art. Those who fail to grasp this usually fail my course." During lunch, Lee sat alone in the grand dining hall, watching other students gather in groups. They seemed to know each other already, laughing and talking about their summers and famous musicians they had met. Lee ate his sandwich quietly, trying not to feel like an outsider. After lunch came the part of the day Lee had been waiting for, free practice time. Each student was assigned a practice room with a piano, but the main hall also had a magnificent grand piano that anyone could use if it was available. Lee entered the main hall, his heart beating faster at the sight of the gleaming black concert grand on the raised platform. The room was mostly empty, with just a few students sitting in the audience seats looking at their phones or reading. He approached the piano slowly, almost reverently. It was a Steinway & Sons, the kind he had only ever seen in pictures or videos online, the kind that cost more money than his family had ever had. Lee sat on the bench and placed his fingers gently on the keys without pressing down. The ivory was cool and smooth under his fingertips. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his courage. Just as he was about to play the first note, a voice boomed through the hall like thunder. "Don't touch my piano, poor soul." Lee's hands jerked away from the keys as if they had suddenly burned him. He looked up to see a tall, imposing man striding toward him, his face red with anger. The man wore a tailored black suit and a scowl that made Lee want to disappear into the floor. I'm sorry," Lee stammered, standing up quickly. "I didn't know it wasn't allowed." "This is not some toy for beginners to bang on," the man said, his voice slightly softer but no less cutting. "This is a concert instrument that costs more than your entire education here." Lee noticed that the few students who had been in the hall were now watching with interest, some hiding smiles behind their hands. "I'm Conductor Blackwood," the man continued, looking down at Lee with cold eyes. "And you are?" "Lee," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Leeway, first-year student. Scholarship? Conductor Blackwood asked, though it sounded more like an accusation than a question. Lee nodded, his cheeks burning. I thought so, the conductor said with a small, satisfied nod. Listen carefully, Mr. Way. This piano is reserved for advanced students and faculty performances. There are practice rooms for students of your level. The way he said level made it clear what he thought of Lee's abilities without having heard him play a single note. Now, off you go. Conductor Blackwood made a shooing motion with his hands. The practice rooms are in the east wing, basement level. Much more suitable for someone like you. Lee grabbed his backpack and walked as quickly as he could without running, feeling the eyes of everyone in the hall on his back. His ears burned with shame, and he blinked rapidly to keep tears from forming. The practice rooms in the basement were small and windowless, with upright pianos that had seen better days. Lee found an empty one and closed the door behind him, finally letting out the breath he felt he had been holding since the conductor had shouted at him. He sat on the bench of the old piano and played a few notes. It was out of tune in spots and some keys stuck slightly when pressed. Still, it was a real piano, and he was at the Wellington Conservatory. This had been his dream for as long as he could remember. Lee began to play, softly at first, then with growing confidence. He played the piece he had used for his scholarship audition, a Chopin nocturne that his old teacher had said suited his playing style. As the familiar melody filled the small room, Lee felt the tension begin to leave his body. Later that evening, as students gathered in the dining hall for dinner, Lee found himself sitting alone again. He picked at his food, still thinking about his embarrassing encounter with Conductor Blackwood. "Is this seat taken?" a friendly voice asked. Lee looked up to see a girl with curly hair and bright eyes holding a tray of food. "No, please." He gestured to the empty chair. "I'm Nisha," she said as she sat down. "First-year violin, Lee, first-year piano." "Oh." Her eyes widened with recognition. "You're the one who had the run-in with Blackwood today. Word travels fast around here." Lee groaned and put his head in his hands. "Great, so everyone knows." "Don't worry about it," Nisha said, spearing a piece of broccoli with her fork. "Blackwood does that to at least one new student every year. It's like a tradition. Last year it was a cellist who used his precious music stand without permission." "Really?" Lee looked up, feeling slightly better. "Absolutely. He's known for it. The man's brilliant but impossible. Some say he was almost concert level himself before an injury, which is why he's so bitter now." Nisha leaned closer. "But between you and me, I think he just likes making people feel small. Makes him feel bigger, you know." Lee nodded, taking a bite of his dinner. "Do you know if there's anywhere else to practice besides those basement rooms?" "The piano I got stuck with is pretty bad." Nisha thought for a moment. "There's an old piano in the west building, 3rd floor. It's in what used to be a music library before they built the new one. Hardly anyone goes there now except to store old sheet music, and we're allowed to use it? Well," Nisha grinned, "no one ever said we weren't allowed." That night, after most students had returned to their dorms, Lee followed Nisha's directions to the old library. The west building was quieter and darker than the main hall, with creaking floors and an air of abandonment. The room on the 3rd floor was large and dusty, with shelves of old sheet music along the walls and a baby grand piano in the center, covered with a cloth. Lee carefully removed the cover to reveal a piano that was older than the one in the main hall, but still beautiful, with a warm, rich tone when he pressed a key. He sat down and began to play, softly at first, then with more confidence as he realized how well the sound was contained in the room. This piano had a voice of its own, not as bright as the Steinway in the main hall perhaps, but deep and resonant. For the first time since arriving at Wellington, Lee felt truly at peace. Here, with no one to judge him or make him feel like he didn't belong, he could play freely. His fingers moved across the keys as naturally as breathing, bringing to life the music that lived inside him. He didn't notice the figure standing in the shadows of the doorway, listening silently before slipping away. In his small dormitory room later that night, as Thomas slept soundly in the bed by the window, Lee made a decision. He would practice harder than he ever had before. He would prove to Conductor Blackwood, and to everyone else at Wellington, that he deserved to be here. Lee fell asleep with melodies still playing in his head, and his hands still feeling the keys beneath his fingers, dreaming of the day when no one would dare tell him not to touch a piano. The next few weeks passed in a blur of classes, practice, and more practice. Lee settled into a routine. Mornings were for theory and music history, afternoons for technique classes, and evenings for his secret sessions in the old library with the forgotten piano. The first month at Wellington was harder than anything Lee had ever experienced. Professor Ruiz, who taught piano technique, seemed determined to tear down and rebuild every aspect of Lee's playing. "Your fingering is all wrong," she would say, tapping his hands with her pencil. "You've taught yourself bad habits. We must correct them before they become permanent." Lee would nod and try again, his fingers feeling like strangers on the keys. Sometimes he wondered if coming to Wellington had been a mistake. Back home, everyone had thought he was extraordinary. Here he was constantly reminded of how much he didn't know. "You're getting better," Nisha told him one day as they walked to lunch together. They had become friends, united by their outsider status. Nisha was one of the few students on a full scholarship besides Lee. "It doesn't feel like it," Lee said, flexing his sore fingers. "Professor Ruiz made me play the same scale for an hour yesterday." "That's because she thinks you're worth the effort," Nisha said. "I've noticed she doesn't bother correcting some of the rich kids as much. They're just here because their parents want them to be." As they entered the dining hall, Lee noticed a group of students gathered around a table, talking excitedly. At the center sat a tall boy with perfectly styled hair and an expensive watch glinting on his wrist. "Who's that?" Lee asked. "Anton Reed," Nisha said, lowering her voice. "Conductor Blackwood's star pupil. His father is famous, owns half the concert halls in the country. Anton's been performing since he was 10. Lee watched as Anton laughed at something someone said, his smile confident and easy. "Is he any good?" Lee asked. "Very good," Nisha admitted. "But he knows it, which makes him insufferable." Later that week, Lee found himself in the same practice room as Anton. The second-year students sometimes came to observe first-year technique classes, supposedly to help as teaching assistants, though most just watched with bored expressions. "Mr. Wei," Professor Ruiz called, "please demonstrate the Czerny exercise we've been working on." Lee moved to the piano at the front of the room, acutely aware of all the eyes watching him. He began to play the technical exercise, focusing on keeping his wrists relaxed and his fingers curved, just as Professor Ruiz had taught him. "Stop," she said after a minute. "Your fourth finger is still collapsing on the black keys. Again, please." Lee started over, trying harder to maintain the correct form. From the corner of his eye, he could see Anton whispering something to a friend, both of them smirking. "Better," Professor Ruiz said when Lee finished. "Now, Mr. Reed, perhaps you could demonstrate for the class? Show them where this technique leads when mastered." Anton moved to the piano with casual confidence. "Of course, Professor." He sat down and launched into a dazzling rendition of a Liszt etude, his fingers flying across the keys with precision and flair. The class watched in awe, and when Anton finished, there was spontaneous applause. He gave a modest nod, but his eyes found Lee's with a look that clearly said, "That's how it's done." That evening, Lee practiced longer than usual in the old library. He played the Czerny exercises over and over until his fingers ached, then moved on to the piece he was preparing for the midterm recital, a Beethoven sonata that Professor Ruiz had assigned. He was so absorbed in his playing that he didn't hear the door open. "I thought I might find someone here," a voice said. Lee jumped and spun around. A man stood in the doorway. Not Conductor Blackwood, but an older gentleman with kind eyes and a slight limp. Lee recognized him as Mr. Chen, the elderly librarian who managed the archive section. "I'm sorry," Lee said quickly. "I didn't think anyone would mind if I used this piano. It was just sitting here and—" Mr. Chen held up a hand. "No need to apologize. This piano has been silent too long." He walked over and ran his fingers lightly across the wood. "She was my companion for many years when I was studying here." "You were a student at Wellington?" Lee asked, surprised. "Long ago," Mr. Chen smiled. "Before my hands decided they had other plans for me." He held up his gnarled fingers, which curved with arthritis. "I wasn't meant for a performer's life, as it turned out. But music has many rooms in its house." Lee nodded, not sure what to say. "You play with feeling," Mr. Chen continued, "but you're fighting the piano. May I?" He gestured to the bench. Lee moved aside and Mr. Chen sat down, his arthritic hands hovering over the keys. "Even with these old hands, I can still remember." He pressed the keys gently, playing a simple but beautiful melody. Despite his bent fingers, the music flowed naturally. "You see?" The piano wants to make music. You don't need to force it. He stood up and motioned for Lee to take his place again. Try closing your eyes. Closing my eyes? I repeated, confused. Yes, you're thinking too much about your fingers, about what everyone has told you. Close your eyes and just listen. Feeling slightly foolish, Lee closed his eyes and placed his hands on the keys. He began to play the opening of the Beethoven sonata. Don't think about the notes, Mr. Chen said softly. Think about what Beethoven was trying to say. Why did he write this piece? What was in his heart? Lee tried to imagine Beethoven, young and angry at his growing deafness, pouring his feelings into the music. Slowly, Lee's rigid technique began to soften. The notes started to breathe. Yes, that's it, Mr. Chen whispered. Now you're speaking with Beethoven's voice, not just reading his words. When Lee opened his eyes again, the piece felt different, alive in a way it hadn't been before. Mr. Chen was smiling. You have a gift, he said. Not just talent, many here have talent. But you have something to say through the music. Don't let them take that from you while they're fixing your technique. After that night, Lee visited Mr. Chen regularly. The old librarian became his unofficial mentor, teaching him things about music that weren't in any of his classes. While professors like Ruiz focused on the mechanics of playing, Mr. Chen spoke of the soul of the music, the stories behind the notes. One evening in late October, Mr. Chen didn't come to the library at their usual time. Lee practiced alone, occasionally glancing at the door. The next day, he learned that Mr. Chen had suffered a stroke and was in the hospital. He's stable, the head librarian told Lee when he asked. But he won't be back this term. Lee felt the loss deeply. Without Mr. Chen's gentle guidance, his practice sessions felt emptier. But he continued to use the old man's advice, closing his eyes while he played to find the heart of the music. The midterm recitals were approaching quickly. Each first-year student would perform before the faculty and the entire student body. It was the first major evaluation, and rumor had it that scholarships had been revoked based on poor performances. Are you ready? Nisha asked as they sat together at breakfast a week before the recitals. I think so, Lee said, though his stomach tightened at the thought. What about you? Terrified, she admitted. I keep dreaming that my strings break in the middle of my piece. They were interrupted by Anton, who stopped at their table with a group of his friends. Look at this, he said, holding out his phone to show them a social media post. They've announced the spring competition schedule. The Zimmermann competition is accepting applications. The Zimmermann was one of the most prestigious competitions for young pianists. Winners often launched professional careers straight out of school. Are you applying? Someone asked Anton. Of course, he replied. Conductor Blackwood is already helping me prepare my program. He glanced at Lee. You should watch the live stream. It might be educational. Lee said nothing, but after Anton left, Nisha rolled her eyes. Ignore him. He's threatened by you, by me. Lee laughed. Why would someone like Anton feel threatened by me? Because people talk, Nisha said. Some of the faculty have heard you playing in the practice rooms. There are whispers that you might be the real deal. The day of the midterm recitals arrived. The main concert hall was packed with students, faculty, and some parents who had come to watch. Lee sat in the audience, waiting for his turn, his hands cold with nervousness. The performances varied wildly. Some students played with technical precision but little emotion. Others had passion but made noticeable mistakes. Nisha performed beautifully on her violin, earning enthusiastic applause. Finally, it was Lee's turn. As he walked to the piano, the same grand piano he had been forbidden to touch on his first day, he saw Conductor Blackwood watching him with narrow eyes from the front row. Lee sat on the bench and took a deep breath. Then, remembering Mr. Chen's advice, he closed his eyes for a moment to center himself. He heard a few whispers from the audience but ignored them. When he opened his eyes, Lee began to play the Beethoven sonata. He started cautiously, his technique careful and correct as Professor Ruiz had taught him. But as the piece progressed, something shifted. Lee found himself thinking of Mr. Chen in his hospital bed, of his family back home who had sacrificed so much for him to be here, of all the nights he had practiced on a keyboard with missing keys. Without planning to, Lee closed his eyes again and let the music take over. His fingers found the keys perfectly despite not looking, as if they knew the way by heart. The sound filled the hall, rich with emotion. Beethoven's defiance in the face of loss, his determination to create beauty despite his growing silence. When the final notes faded, Lee opened his eyes to absolute stillness. For a terrible moment, he thought he had made a horrible mistake. Then the applause began. Hesitant at first, then growing until it filled the hall. Lee stood and bowed, his legs shaky. As he looked out at the audience, he saw various expressions: surprise, admiration, and on Anton's face, unmistakable concern. But it was Conductor Blackwood's expression that caught Lee's attention most. The stern man was leaning forward in his seat, his eyes fixed on Lee with an intensity that was almost physical. There was no smile, no approval, just a calculating look that seemed to be reassessing everything he had assumed about the scholarship student who had dared to touch his piano. The day after the midterm recitals, Lee entered his technique class to find the room buzzing with whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when he walked in. He slid into his seat, keeping his eyes down, but he could feel the stares of his classmates. Professor Ruiz entered a moment later, silencing the room with her presence. "Good morning, students." Her eyes swept across the class before landing on Lee. "Mr. Wei, please stay after class. I need to speak with you." Lee's stomach tightened. Had he done something wrong? His performance had received applause, but perhaps the faculty had different standards. He barely heard the lesson as his mind raced through possibilities. When class ended, he approached Professor Ruiz's desk with dread. "Your performance yesterday," she began, arranging sheet music into a neat pile. "It was unexpected." "I'm sorry if I disappointed you," Lee said quickly. Professor Ruiz looked up, surprise crossing her face. "Disappointed? No, that's not what I meant." She set down the papers. "Your technique still needs refinement, but you played with a maturity I didn't expect from a first-year student." She paused. "Particularly when you closed your eyes." Lee felt his cheeks warm. "I know it looks showy, but it's not about how it looks," Professor Ruiz interrupted. "It's about why you do it. Some students close their eyes to appear dramatic. You close yours to listen more deeply." She leaned forward slightly. "Where did you learn that?" Lee hesitated before answering. "It wasn't really taught to me. Back home, we couldn't always afford electricity. I practiced in the dark a lot." Something softened in Professor Ruiz's expression. "Necessity becomes strength. Interesting." She handed him a folder. "This is your new assignment. Conductor Blackwood suggested it specifically for you." Lee opened the folder to find sheet music for Franz Liszt's La Campanella, one of the most technically challenging pieces in piano literature. "This is advanced," he said, flipping through pages filled with lightning-fast runs and leaps across the keyboard. "Conductor Blackwood believes you're ready for it," Professor Ruiz said, though her tone suggested she might not agree. "He wants you to perform it at the winter showcase next month." "Next month?" Lee's head snapped up. Most students had an entire term to prepare showcase pieces. "Yes? And?" Professor Ruiz hesitated. "He specifically requested that you play it with your eyes closed." Lee left the classroom in a daze, the folder clutched to his chest. In the hallway, he nearly collided with Nisha, who grabbed his arm. "There you are. Everyone's talking about your performance," she said excitedly. "You were amazing." "Thanks," Lee said distractedly. "But now I have to learn this in a month." He showed her the music. Nisha's eyes widened. "La Campanella? That's insane. Even third years struggle with this piece." She looked at him with concern. "Why would Blackwood assign you something so difficult?" "I don't know," Lee said, but a sinking feeling told him this wasn't meant as a favor. That afternoon, Lee skipped lunch to secure a practice room. He spread the sheet music before him and began slowly working through the first page, his fingers stumbling over the complex passages. An hour later, he had progressed only a few measures. This was beyond anything he'd ever attempted. The piece required not just technical skill, but extraordinary precision. The hands had to jump great distances across the keyboard with perfect accuracy. "Having trouble?" Lee looked up to see Anton standing in the doorway, a smug smile on his face. "Just working on a new piece," Lee said, trying to sound casual. Anton stepped into the room. "La Campanella. A bit ambitious, isn't it?" He glanced over the music. "Blackwood assigned this to me last year. I had 3 months to prepare it." "Well, I have 1 month," Lee said, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Anton raised an eyebrow. "1 month? That's impossible." He laughed softly. "But I suppose that's the point." "What do you mean?" Anton leaned against the wall. Come on, Wei. You must realize what's happening. Your little eye-closing trick got attention. Blackwood doesn't like anyone stealing the spotlight from his chosen students. It's not a trick, Lee said, his hands tightening into fists. Whatever you say. Anton pushed off from the wall. But a word of advice. Blackwood doesn't set people up to succeed. He's testing you and he expects you to fail spectacularly. He paused at the door, especially if you try to play that piece with your eyes closed. After Anton left, Lee stared at the music with growing despair. Was this a trap? Was Blackwood deliberately setting him an impossible task? That evening, instead of going to his usual spot in the old library, Lee went to the hospital. Mr. Chen was awake, sitting up in bed and looking frail but alert. Lee, he smiled weakly, I wondered if you would visit. I'm sorry I didn't come sooner, Lee said, taking a seat beside the bed. How are you feeling? Better each day, Mr. Chen said. They tell me I might return to work next term with reduced hours. His eyes sharpened. But you didn't come to discuss my health. Something is troubling you. Lee pulled the sheet music from his bag and told Mr. Chen everything, the recital, Blackwood's assignment, Anton's warning. Mr. Chen listened quietly, then asked to see the music. His arthritic fingers traced the notes slowly. Liszt, he murmured. The showman of the Romantic era. He looked up at Lee. Do you know what La Campanella means? Lee shook his head. The little bell, Mr. Chen translated. Liszt was inspired by Paganini's violin technique, the rapid repetition of notes that ring like tiny bells. He handed the music back to Litigants considered nearly impossible to play. Perfectly. So Blackwood does want me to fail, Lee said, his suspicion confirmed. Perhaps, Mr. Chen acknowledged. Or perhaps he sees something in you that deserves to be challenged. He shifted in his bed, wincing slightly. The question is not why he assigned it, but what you will do now. I don't know if I can learn it in time, Lee admitted. Not with conventional methods, no, Mr. Chen agreed. But you have an advantage others don't. What's that? Your darkness, Mr. Chen said simply. Most pianists learn with their eyes, memorizing the positions, watching their hands. You learned differently. Your hands know the keyboard in a way others can't understand. But this piece requires jumping all over the keyboard with perfect accuracy, Lee protested. Yes, Mr. Chen nodded. And who better to navigate in the dark than someone who has lived there? For the next week, Lee practiced with a determination that bordered on obsession. He started each morning at 5, securing a practice room before other students were awake. Between classes, he studied the score, memorizing every note. Evenings were spent in the old library, working until his fingers cramped and his eyes burned with fatigue. He broke the piece into tiny sections, mastering each fragment before moving to the next. During practice, he alternated between watching his hands and closing his eyes, testing his spatial awareness of the keyboard. Nisha brought him food when he forgot to eat, which was often. You're going to make yourself sick, she warned, forcing a sandwich into his hands one evening. I can't stop now, Lee said, taking a distracted bite. I'm starting to feel the pattern. It was true. Something strange was happening as Lee immersed himself in the music. The keyboard was becoming a landscape he could navigate by feel alone, like a blind person knowing exactly how many steps to their front door. His fingers began to memorize not just the notes, but the exact distances between them, the subtle differences in height between white and black keys, the minute variations in touch that each key required. 2 weeks into his practice marathon, Lee received an unexpected visitor in the old library. He was deep into a particularly difficult passage when a voice broke his concentration. So this is where you've been hiding. Lee's hands froze over the keys. Conductor Blackwood stood in the doorway, his imposing figure silhouetted against the hall light. Sir, Lee began, standing quickly. Sit, Blackwood commanded, walking into the room. Continue what you were doing. Lee sat back down nervously and resumed playing, acutely aware of Blackwood's critical gaze. After a few measures, his anxiety made him miss a jump, hitting a jarring wrong note. Stop, Blackwood said. He approached the piano, looking at Lee with an unreadable expression. You've been working on this day and night according to your professors. Lee nodded, unsure if this was an accusation. Play the opening again, Blackwood instructed. But this time, close your eyes. Lee hesitated, then complied. With his eyes closed, he took a deep breath and began again. Without the distraction of watching, his fingers found their way more confidently, dancing through the rapid notes with growing precision. Enough, Blackwood said after about a minute. Lee opened his eyes to find the conductor studying him intently. Interesting. Your playing improves approximately 20% with your eyes closed. Most students show the opposite pattern. It's how I learned, sir, Lee explained cautiously. Yes, Professor Ruiz mentioned your unusual background. Blackwood walked around the piano, his hand trailing along its edge. This instrument has seen better days. It has a good sound, Lee defended. Indeed. Blackwood struck a key thoughtfully. Tell me, Wei, why do you want to be a pianist? The question caught Lee off guard. Because music is the only thing that ever made complete sense to me, he answered honestly. Blackwood nodded slowly. The winter showcase is in 2 weeks. You'll perform last. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Wei, I'll expect you to play the entire piece with your eyes closed, since that appears to be your particular talent. After Blackwood left, Lee sat motionless on the bench. The conductor's words echoed in his mind. Was that a compliment or a challenge? Or was it, as Anton had suggested, a setup for public humiliation? Lee closed his eyes again and placed his hands on the keys. He had come too far to back down now. If Blackwood wanted a performance, he would give him one. Not just with his eyes closed, but with his whole heart open. The next day, Lee received a message to report to the main hall at 7 in the evening. When he arrived, the hall was empty except for Blackwood, who stood beside the grand Steinway. From now until the showcase, you will practice here every evening for 1 hour, Blackwood announced without preamble. On this piano, since this is where you'll perform. Lee couldn't believe what he was hearing. You're letting me use the concert grand? How can you perform on an instrument you don't know? Blackwood asked impatiently. 1 hour each evening, no more. I'll be monitoring your progress. As the showcase approached, Lee settled into his new routine. Each evening, under Blackwood's critical eye, he refined his performance on the magnificent Steinway. The conductor rarely spoke, only occasionally barking a correction or demonstrating a particular technique. Lee couldn't tell if Blackwood was setting him up to succeed or to fail, but one thing became clear. The man was a brilliant pianist himself. His demonstrations, though brief, revealed exceptional skill and understanding of Liszt's music. The night before the showcase, after Lee's final practice session, Blackwood broke his usual silence. You've made acceptable progress, he said, closing the piano lid. Remember, music isn't just about hitting the right notes. It's about making the audience forget there are notes at all. With that cryptic advice, he left Lee alone in the hall, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The morning of the winter showcase arrived with a heavy snowfall that blanketed the campus in white. Lee stood at his dormitory window, watching students trudge through the snow, their breath visible in the cold air. His own breath fogged the glass as he rested his forehead against it. Nervous? Thomas asked from behind him, though still not exactly friendly. His roommate had become more civil since Lee's midterm performance. Terrified, Lee admitted. Everyone's talking about your piece, Thomas said, pulling on a sweater. No one's attempted La Campanella at a winter showcase before. It's usually reserved for graduation recitals. Lee turned from the window. Thanks, that helps a lot. Thomas shrugged. Just saying what everyone's thinking. He grabbed his bag. Good luck tonight. Try not to embarrass yourself too badly. After Thomas left, Lee sat on his bed and flexed his fingers. They felt stiff with tension. Tonight would either be his triumph or his humiliation. There would be no middle ground. His phone buzzed with a text from Nisha. Hospital first, then breakfast. Mr. Chen wants to wish you luck. The hospital was quieter than usual, with most visitors still struggling through the snow. Mr. Chen was sitting up in bed, looking stronger than the last time Lee had visited. A small potted plant with red flowers sat on his bedside table, new since Lee's last visit. Ah, the man of the hour, Mr. Chen smiled as Lee and Nisha entered. Ready for tonight? As ready as I'll ever be, Lee said, taking a seat. He's being modest, Nisha chimed in. I heard him practicing yesterday. It was incredible. Not incredible, Lee corrected her. Just getting there. The middle section still gives me trouble. The part with the repeated notes? Mr. Chen asked. When Lee nodded, the old man's face grew thoughtful. Remember what I told you about Liszt being inspired by Paganini? The violinist's ability to make one note sound like many? Lee nodded again. Don't think of them as separate notes, Mr. Chen advised. Think of them as echoes of the same note, like dropping a pebble in water and watching the ripples spread. Lee tried to imagine this, his fingers twitching slightly as if playing invisible keys. And most importantly, Mr. Chen continued, remember why you're playing, not to impress Blackwood or to prove yourself to the school. You're playing because the music deserves to be heard. On the way to breakfast, Nisha nudged Lee's arm. He's right, you know. You've already proven yourself to everyone who matters. Not to myself, Lee said quietly. The day passed in a blur of last-minute practice and nervous anticipation. By late afternoon, Lee retreated to his dorm room to rest before the evening's performance. He lay on his bed, eyes closed, mentally playing through the piece, his fingers moving in the air above him. A knock at the door interrupted his concentration. Lee opened it to find Professor Ruiz standing in the hallway, a serious expression on her face. "Mr. Wei," she said, "may I come in?" Lee stepped aside, puzzled by the unexpected visit. Professor Ruiz rarely sought out students outside of class. She entered the small room and looked around briefly before turning to face him. "I wanted to speak with you before tonight's showcase. Is something wrong?" Lee asked, his anxiety spiking. "Not wrong precisely." Professor Ruiz adjusted her glasses. "I'm concerned about Conductor Blackwood's interest in you." "His interest?" Professor Ruiz sighed. "Conductor Blackwood has a history of identifying students with unusual talent and testing them severely. Sometimes these tests help students reach their potential. Other times," she trailed off. "What happens other times?" Lee prompted. "They break," she said simply. "The pressure becomes too much or the public failure too devastating." She fixed Lee with a penetrating look. "I've seen promising careers end before they began because a student was pushed too far, too fast." Lee's mouth felt dry. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I believe you have real talent, Mr. Wei. Not just technical skill, but genuine musicality." She paused. "And because I want you to know that if you feel you're not ready to perform La Campanella tonight, I can speak to the dean about a substitute piece." The offer was tempting. For a moment, Lee imagined the relief of playing something simpler, something safe. But then he thought of all the hours he'd poured into learning Liszt's challenging masterpiece, all the nights practicing until his fingers cramped. "Thank you, Professor," he said finally, "but I need to see this through." Professor Ruiz nodded, looking unsurprised. "I thought you might say that. In that case, I wish you luck." She moved toward the door, then stopped. "Oh, and Mr. Wei, whatever happens tonight, remember that one performance doesn't define a musician. It's the lifetime of performances that matters." By 7 o'clock, the concert hall was filled to capacity. The winter showcase was a major event at Wellington, attended not only by students and faculty but by alumni, donors, and occasionally talent scouts from major orchestras and music agencies. Backstage, Lee peeked through the curtains at the growing audience. His heart hammered against his ribs when he spotted several people in the front row, wearing the distinctive pins of the National Symphony Orchestra. Checking out the competition, Anton's voice came from behind him. Lee turned to see the older student dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his hair immaculately styled. "Just seeing who's here." "Everyone's here," Anton said with a thin smile, "including Zimmerman competition judges." He nodded toward two elderly people sitting near the center. "They rarely attend student showcases. Word is they're here specifically to see certain performances." The implication in his tone was clear. Before Lee could respond, a stagehand called for all performers to take their assigned seats in the wings. Lee found his place beside Nisha, who was nervously adjusting her violin strings. "You okay?" he whispered. She gave him a tight smile. "Ask me again when it's over." The showcase began with performances by first-year students, followed by second years and then third years. The quality improved noticeably with each group. By the time the third-year students finished, the bar had been set intimidatingly high. "And now," announced the dean, a tall woman with silver hair, "we have a special performance. First-year student Li Wei will perform Franz Liszt's La Campanella." A murmur rippled through the audience. Lee rose from his seat on shaky legs. Nisha squeezed his hand as he passed. "Remember the ripples," she whispered. The walk to the piano felt like crossing an ocean. Lai was acutely aware of every face turned toward him, every eye following his progress. He spotted conductor Blackwood in the front row, his expression inscrutable. Lai reached the piano and bowed to polite applause. As he sat on the bench, he adjusted it slightly, then placed his hands in his lap. He took one deep breath, then another. Then, without warning, he closed his eyes. Another murmur went through the audience, louder this time. Lee knew what they were thinking. Closing your eyes for expressive moments was one thing. Beginning a piece as technically demanding as La Campanella without looking at the keyboard was another entirely. Lee blocked out the whispers. He focused on feeling the piano before him, sensing rather than seeing the keys. He raised his hands and placed them precisely where they needed to be, and then he began to play. The opening trills sparkled like morning dew, each note crystal clear. Lee's fingers danced across the keyboard, finding each key with perfect accuracy, despite the leaps and jumps the piece demanded. He felt rather than thought his way through the music, his body knowing where to move before his mind could direct it. As the piece progressed into the main theme, with its bell-like repeated notes, Lee remembered Mr. Chen's advice. Not separate notes, but ripples from a single source. His right hand moved with increasing confidence, creating the illusion of tiny bells ringing throughout the hall. Time seemed to bend around him. Lai was no longer aware of the audience or the stakes of his performance. There was only the music speaking through him, using his hands as its voice. When he reached the middle section, the part that had given him the most trouble, something strange happened. Instead of tightening with anxiety, Lee felt himself relax deeper into the music. His fingers found a flow they had never achieved in practice, moving with a speed and accuracy that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his conscious control. The piece built toward its climax, the difficulty increasing with every bar. Rapid octaves, hand crossings, and dizzying arpeggios followed one after another. Lee's fingers flew across the keyboard, sweat forming on his brow with the effort, yet his face remained serene, his eyes still closed. In the final section, where Liszt had packed every pianistic challenge imaginable into a breathtaking finale, Lee felt as though he were riding a wild current, dangerous but exhilarating. The notes poured from his fingers, filling the hall with sound that seemed impossible to be coming from just two hands. As he struck the final chords, Lee felt a surge of emotion so powerful it almost broke his concentration, but his fingers remained true, landing the last triumphant notes with perfect precision. For a moment after the final note faded, there was complete silence. Lee sat motionless at the piano, his eyes still closed, his heart pounding. Had he failed? Had he made mistakes he hadn't noticed? Then the applause began, tentative at first, then growing into a roar that shook the hall. Lee opened his eyes to see the audience on their feet, their faces showing astonishment and delight. He stood and bowed, his legs trembling beneath him. As he straightened, his eyes met conductor Blackwood's. The stern man was not applauding, but watching Lee with an intensity that was almost physical. Backstage, Lai was surrounded by fellow students offering congratulations and asking questions. How did you do that? Have you always been able to play with your eyes closed? Were you really playing from memory? Lee answered as best he could, still dazed from the experience. Finally, Nisha pushed through the crowd and pulled him into a fierce hug. You did it, she whispered in his ear. You were amazing. Over her shoulder, Lee saw Anton standing apart from the others, his face a mask of controlled emotion. Their eyes met briefly before Anton turned and walked away. Later, as the crowd thinned and students began leaving for the post-showcase reception, Lee felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find conductor Blackwood standing behind him. My office, tomorrow morning 8 o'clock, the conductor said without preamble. Before Lee could respond, Blackwood added, Bring your competition repertoire. Competition repertoire? Lee repeated, confused. I'm not registered for any competitions. A thin smile appeared on Blackwood's face. You are now. The Zimmerman preliminaries are in 3 weeks. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Wei? Well played. As Blackwood walked away, Lee stood frozen in place, trying to process what had just happened. The Zimmerman competition, the most prestigious piano competition for young artists, the one that launched careers, and somehow, he had just been entered. The 3 weeks before the Zimmerman competition preliminaries passed in a blur of intense preparation. Lee's life narrowed to a strict routine. Morning classes, afternoon sessions with conductor Blackwood, evenings practicing alone, and nights spent dreaming of music. Blackwood had selected an ambitious competition program: Bach's Prelude and Fugue in D minor, Beethoven's Appassionata Sonata, Chopin's Ballad No. 1, and of course, Liszt's La Campanella. It was a program that would challenge even third-year students, but Blackwood seemed confident in Lee's abilities. Again, Blackwood would say during their sessions, stopping Lee mid-phrase, "You're playing the notes, but you're not speaking their language yet." He would demonstrate, his hands moving across the keys with remarkable fluency despite his age, showing Lee how a slight change in timing or touch could transform a passage from merely correct to deeply moving. Lee absorbed everything, practicing until his fingers ached and his eyes burned with fatigue. When his technique faltered, he closed his eyes and relied on his extraordinary spatial awareness of the keyboard, feeling his way through the most difficult passages. The morning before they were to leave for the competition in the city, Lee visited Mr. Chen, who had finally been released from the hospital. The old librarian was back at work, though only for half days, looking thinner but with the same bright intelligence in his eyes. "Are you ready?" Mr. Chen asked, organizing sheet music at his desk. "I don't know," Lee admitted. "Blackwood seems to think I am." "And what do you think?" Lee considered the question. "I think I've never played better in my life. But the Zimmerman isn't like a school showcase. These are the best young pianists in the country." Mr. Chen nodded. "True, but music isn't a race or a competition, even when we pretend it is." He selected a book from a nearby shelf and handed it to Lee. "This might interest you." The book was an old biography of Franz Liszt. Lee opened it to find a portrait of the composer as a young man, his face intense and passionate. "Did you know," Mr. Chen said, "that Liszt was once called a sorcerer? People said his playing was so extraordinary, so beyond what seemed humanly possible, that he must have made a deal with the devil." "Like the stories about Paganini," Lee said, remembering his music history class exactly. "But do you know what made Liszt truly revolutionary?" Mr. Chen leaned forward. "He was one of the first to understand that a piano performance isn't just about playing notes. It's about casting a spell over the audience, making them feel something they've never felt before." Lee looked down at the portrait again. "How do I do that?" "You already know how," Mr. Chen said softly. "When you close your eyes, you're not just playing from memory. You're letting the music play through you. That's your magic, Lee." The next day, Lee, conductor Blackwood, and 3 other Wellington students who had qualified for different divisions of the competition traveled to the city. The preliminary rounds would be held in the Garrison Concert Hall, a historic venue known for its perfect acoustics and intimidating atmosphere. As they entered the hall for registration, Lee was struck by the number of competitors. Dozens of young pianists from all over the country, many accompanied by famous teachers. He felt small and provincial in comparison, despite Blackwood's imposing presence beside him. "Way, over here." Blackwood directed Lee to the registration table. As they approached, Lee noticed several judges and officials nodding respectfully to Blackwood. Despite his difficult personality, the conductor clearly commanded respect in the music world. "Conductor Blackwood," greeted one of the officials, a woman with a clipboard. "We weren't expecting to see you here this year. Your students usually compete in the senior division." "An exception this year," Blackwood replied. "This is Lee Wei, junior division." The woman checked her list. "Ah, yes. The late entry." She looked at Lee with interest. "You're scheduled to perform tomorrow at 3 p.m. She handed him a packet of information. "Practice rooms are available on a first-come, first-served basis. 20 minutes maximum per session." As they walked away, Lee flipped through the packet. "I'm number 23, he said. "That's near the end." "Good," Blackwood nodded. "The judges will be alert after their break, and you'll have time to observe some of the other performers." They spent the rest of the day settling into the hotel and taking turns in the practice rooms. Lee managed to secure 3 20-minute sessions, enough to run through the most challenging parts of his program. By evening, his nerves were wound tight as piano strings. "Try to sleep," Blackwood advised as they parted for the night. "Tomorrow, remember what we've worked on. Precision with passion, control with abandon." He fixed Lee with his penetrating gaze. "And Wei, no matter what happens, you've already surpassed expectations, mine included." Coming from Blackwood, it was high praise indeed, though Lee was too anxious to fully appreciate it. The next morning, Lee woke early and practiced finger exercises on the edge of his hotel bed. He met Blackwood for a silent breakfast. Then they headed to the concert hall to observe the first performers. The level of playing was intimidating. Even the least impressive competitors would have been standouts at Wellington. Lee watched from the back of the hall, his anxiety growing with each polished performance. Around noon, he spotted a familiar figure entering the hall, Anton, accompanied by his father, a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit. They took seats near the front. Lee shrank down in his chair, hoping not to be noticed, but Anton's sharp eyes found him anyway. The older student raised an eyebrow in acknowledgement before turning his attention to the stage. "What's he doing here?" Lee whispered to Blackwood. "Read? Probably scouting the competition for next year." Blackwood replied, "He'll be eligible for the senior division then." As 3 o'clock approached, Lee retreated to a practice room for one final session. His hands were cold with nervousness, and no matter how much he tried to warm them, they remained stiff and uncooperative. Passages he had played flawlessly now felt clumsy and uncertain. "This isn't working," he muttered to himself, closing the piano lid in frustration. He sat for a moment, eyes closed, trying to calm his racing heart. An image came to him, the old piano in the library at Wellington, where he had first found freedom in his playing. He thought of Mr. Chen's words about casting a spell, about letting the music play through him. Lee opened his eyes with new resolve. He couldn't recreate the safety of that library room here, but he could recapture the feeling, the pure joy of making music without fear or expectation. When his name was called, Lee walked onto the stage with steady steps. The hall was larger than any he had performed in before, with tiered seating that seemed to rise endlessly into the shadows. In the front row sat the judges, 7 stern-faced musicians with clipboards and inscrutable expressions. Blackwood sat a few rows back, his face equally unreadable. Near him, Lee spotted Anton and his father watching intently. Lee bowed, then seated himself at the gleaming concert grand. This piano was even finer than the one at Wellington. With a touch so responsive it seemed to anticipate his intentions. He began with Bach, the mathematical precision of the prelude and fugue demanding his complete concentration. His fingers found their rhythm, moving through the complex counterpoint with growing confidence. When he finished the Bach, there was a brief rustling of papers as the judges made notes. Next came Beethoven's Appassionata, with its thunderous emotions and technical challenges. Lee felt himself warming to the task. His earlier nervousness transformed into a focused energy that flowed through his hands into the keyboard. He was no longer playing for the judges or even for Blackwood. He was playing for the music itself, honoring what Beethoven had written with every fiber of his being. The Chopin Ballade followed, a piece that told a story without words, moving from lyrical beauty to stormy drama. As Lee played, he kept his eyes open, watching his hands navigate the keyboard with precision. But something felt missing, a connection, a depth that he knew the piece deserved. As he approached the final piece, Liszt's La Campanella, Lee made a decision. This piece had changed everything for him. It deserved his truest performance. He paused, took a deep breath, and closed his eyes. A murmur went through the audience. Lee could sense the judges leaning forward, pens poised above their clipboards. But he was no longer concerned with their reactions. He had entered a space where only the music existed. His hands found the keys unerringly, beginning the delicate opening trills. As he progressed into the main theme with its bell-like repeated notes, his fingers moved with a freedom and assurance that surpassed even his showcase performance. The technical challenges that had seemed so daunting during practice now felt like a joyful dance, his hands flying across the keyboard with the surety of birds finding their way home. In this state of complete musical immersion, Lee discovered new depths in the piece, subtle voicings and colors that he had never consciously planned. The piano responded to his touch as if it were an extension of his own body, producing sounds that rang through the hall with crystalline clarity. When the final notes faded away, Lee remained motionless for a moment, his eyes still closed, reluctant to break the spell. Then he opened his eyes and rose to bow to the silent audience. The judges' faces revealed nothing as they wrote their final comments. As Lee walked off stage, his legs felt suddenly weak. He had given everything he had to the performance, holding nothing back. Whether it would be enough, he couldn't know. Blackwood met him in the green room, his expression unusually soft. "Well done," he said simply. They waited together as the final competitors performed and the judges deliberated. The preliminary results would be announced that evening. Only 5 pianists from each division would advance to the finals the following day. When the announcement finally came, Lee stood with the other competitors in the lobby, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear the names being called. From the junior division, advancing to tomorrow's finals are Jin Park, Olivia Novak, David Chen, Min Tran. There was just one name left. Lee held his breath. And Li Wei. A hand clapped him on the shoulder. Blackwood, his face showing the closest thing to a genuine smile Lee had ever seen from him. "Now the real work begins," the conductor said. As the crowd dispersed, Lee found himself face to face with Anton, who had pushed through the crowd toward him. "Congratulations," Anton said, his voice tight but sincere. "Your list was impressive." Before Lee could respond, Anton's father appeared beside them. "So this is the prodigy Blackwood has been mentioning," he said, appraising Lee with experienced eyes. "Unusual technique, closing your eyes like that." "It's not a technique, sir," Lee said. "It's just how I hear the music best." Anton's father nodded thoughtfully. "Well, it's certainly effective. Controversial perhaps, but effective." He handed Lee a card. "When you're ready for a manager, call me. Talent like yours deserves the right guidance." As they walked away, Lee stared at the card in his hand, stunned by this unexpected turn of events. "Don't look so surprised." "Wei," Blackwood said, appearing at his side. "This is just the beginning." Lee thought of how far he had come, from the boy who was told not to touch the piano to a finalist in the country's most prestigious competition. And he knew, whatever tomorrow might bring, that Blackwood was right. This wasn't an ending, but a beginning. His journey as a musician, his true journey, was just starting to unfold.